approaching translation of some of the shapes, especially whenever you see some textures, a lot of smaller shapes interlacing with larger shapes, or lighter shapes with darker, you would like to interpret these as textures. Okay, and now translate this here as textures consisting of shapes that are not realistic. There's this, if you think about the visual texture, there's always a certain rhythm of interlacing different shapes. Okay, there's a repetition of them, but a repetition of a certain sequence of colors, or those qualities of shapes, their sizes, their values. And in the very first part of this assignment, which is black and white, you will work with creating textures out of black and white spaces or shapes. And in the color part of this, you will be translating those graphic textures into color. And you will still think about optical mixing at the same time. In both, you will be thinking about optical mixing of these shapes. Apart from optical mixing, we will certainly talk about graphic density as well, and progressive actions here that you can perform or use in your design. So if I think about the brightest or the lightest section in terms of value, lightest section in this entire image, that would be the section with clouds and sky, right? So that also tells me, so there are a couple of things. If we think about optical mixing and texture, definitely we can use it here, okay? It's a little bit easier to think about texture here, right? We can, however, still apply some type of texture here as well. We have some differentiation between lighter and darker shapes here, although it's a very minimal differentiation. Overall, the section is extremely light. What does it mean is that the graphic density is very low. If graphic density is very low, let's say it's about 5% of black, okay, or maybe even less. In some areas it's basically white, okay? So it gives you an idea how to treat the section in a graphic way, right? That gives you an idea, well, if the graphic density is that low, that means that you have to expose more of the white, so it will feel light. You want to decrease the amount of value contrast between black and white. You can still use, however, texture to show it. So how you would express this, and I will use here, well, you can use X-Acto knife for cutting shapes, of course. This is extremely important and probably the best tool, but for this assignment, you don't need to necessarily have all the shapes straight. And it can be intentionally wavy or just not necessarily straight. Okay, so I'm going to use thin stripes of paper cut with scissors. There is some irregularity to the edges here, but if I cut large amount of shapes like this, then they will appear uniform. You could do this also with X-Acto knife again, cutting against the straight edge, then you will have all the edges very, very straight. Okay, so it's up to you. Imagine that will be much darker, and then you see the contrast between other. If I cover this, and it won't be that white right now. So these sections will definitely have more dark. Okay, there will be the graphic density will be higher. That means that there will be more darks showing up in those sections. Right now I don't have anything, so it's a little bit hard. So now if I distribute these, start creating some type of texture or pattern with shapes like that, so it can be like this, it could be parallel. But the idea is that there's a little bit of black, but mostly what is showing up, okay, within this area, this is relatively light, low density, more white showing up. So it could be interpreted, it could help to interpret the sky area. You see, like, I'm completely disregarding the shapes of clouds that I see there. I'm not going to try to fit these shapes into shapes of clouds. I'm thinking about the entire section rather. Okay? It's not always the case, but in this situation, yes, you can. You could identify that this density here and this shape is getting darker, so the graphic density should be higher, a little bit higher, so then you can have less spaces between those dark fine lines. Okay, there are many ways of approaching it. You can actually go with parallel lines like this and have, for example, even spaces. So by the way, I may want to explain two concepts here. I'm going to cut a few more. The density is still very, very low. This is how you could interpret the sky. So definitely it's very bright if you think about like a snapshot, a portion of that. Okay, you could still have these lines even thinner and spread them even more out if you think that overall the density is still much, much lower. So more white is showing up. This is a way also to interpret gray areas, different grays. If we did a black and white printout of it, we would see the sky as kind of some type of grayish color, or in terms of value scale, it would be pretty light gray. Okay, so the density, the gaps in between. So if I bring them closer, that density is changing. There's less white in between. It's still rhythmic, but you see that the density goes up. It's getting darker, so that gray is getting darker as well. So with graphic density, you're expressing relative lightness and darkness of compositional parts in your image. Okay, so it's probably even darker than this. The shapes are becoming so fine, we start thinking of optical mixing then. It gets a little bit denser. So the optical mixing helps us. You can even squint your eyes to see it better. But if it's seen from farther away, the black stripes mix a little bit with white stripes that will occur also in color. And so we start thinking about this entire shape here or area as one type of color or value. Okay, it's a little easier when these shapes are fine. Okay, finer, thinner. This gets darker, the density goes even more up. It almost becomes as solid as these darks here. Okay, so So this is how you would think here about optical mixing, texture, density. Now, if you think about progressive action, well, you can change the size of these so they can get larger progressively. Okay, these strips, you could do that. Now in color, I would interpret this in, because it's a very open area. Okay, so let's remember that in black and white, definitely there's a lot more white that will show here. If there's optical mixing, definitely there are more white gaps that we see, white gaps of the crystal, and we can see through because density is very low, and it's a pretty open area. Okay, the closed area, these are the darkest values that you perceive in your design, and so probably some of these, just to recap, this is closed area. This piece of paper is extremely dark or black. Okay, so when you have shapes very close to each other to the degree that there is no white in between, or you're just interpreting some of those shapes that you're seeing in just a larger block of black shape, that will be closed area, as opposed to open area where there is very low density and mostly white is shown. In color, to express that, I would use then these shapes, color shapes, need to be really light. So in terms of value, they are the lightest values that I would use for expressing a bright light sky. I really would like you to find your own palette. Please don't use necessarily, it will be much more challenging, more exciting for you to find different color palettes for each section that differ from the original photo. Also, I chose these shapes in such a way, these colors, that the boundaries between them, and we already know something about the boundaries, we went through those studies, those are not that harsh between these colors. Okay, those boundaries, maybe they don't blur, but they are not as strong as, for example, I would use this color. Definitely the boundary is extreme. Okay, so there is a lot of contrast here. So since I'm thinking about the entire open area here, there's not much contrast between the shapes within that area. I would use, for example, these colors. I could kind of maybe use a blue, although temperature wise it's opposite, and maybe that creates a little bit more boundary here. So I would stick to these. There is some suggestion of progressive action here. So I suggested that with changing the size of shapes, precisely their width. Okay, so this is how you can do that. You can suggest that the sequence is moving across the space. We have some contrast. It's very rhythmical between light shapes of yellow and this peach-like color, with this a little bit darker shape of this color, but it's very minimal. Okay, so overall the entire area becomes really nice and bright. So it feels still pretty open. Since the boundaries are not that harsh between the colors, Optical mixing is also very nice here. And so this is that would be one of the many actually interpretations for this lightest section. I would probably look for different sizes of shapes and generally different shapes for other sections, okay? And it's not like the entire section has to be the same looking. You can still, you know, think about maybe, well, progressive action can be even stronger here if you start changing the direction of stripes, and maybe that will become a little bit more dynamic when we introduce some diagonals as well. Okay, so think this way as well. Maybe that would be more appropriate to lower parts of this image, where there's more contrast or more there are darker and bolder textures. So for bolder textures, you would like to look for more contrast between color shapes. That contrast can be in terms of value contrast or intensity. So we have both here, called value and intensity contrast.